Axel asked me to speak about another aspect of my research in a way, but more in the associative and nonprofit sides about open science, and with a kind of critical point of view. So like both explaining why open science is a good thing, and meanwhile delineating how it can be also a washing and sadly used for more marketing purpose. So this is the title, like open knowledge to open washing. And so this connect more, not to my affiliation to the Institut Pasteur, but more to Hack Your PhD, which is like an association I created in 2012 with Celia Gruzoner, with more in epistemology and sociology of science. And where in 2012 we started to wonder why science now pretends to be open. Was it closed before? So it was strange, yeah. And over like 7 years, we have done like more than 80 interviews, meeting researchers and people trying to understand how to open their practices and understand more at the sociological and anthropological level what open science meant to them, what were their underlying values. And we organized a lot of gathering and events in, for instance, Squat or Hackerspace, this kind of third place in the society that are popping up everywhere, and doing collective curation around these topics. Like our goal was not to set what open science was, but more question what people think it was, and have people discussing it and collecting data collegially. And so we have a blog called Hack Your PhD, but since we are not anymore PhD in the association over the years, like 7 years later, we're gonna replace now to Hack Your Research. So next it's gonna be Hack Your Research, but we're gonna keep everything else. And so for the workshop, for instance, we started, for instance, things like the hands-on this morning, but for low-income societal status in those out of university, for teaching people how to code, because I'm personally convinced that learning to code gonna be more and more critical, like learning to read and write in modern society. You're gonna use software code by others, and if you're not coding yourself, you're just like spectatorial to that. So from the bottom up, it's a very grassroots movement that we try to do. And meanwhile, also workshop about business models and legal structure compatible with openness of knowledge. Because, well, saying that you should open your data and everything, the reality strikes back, and sometimes from a property point of view, there's a lot of legal problems, and even if you want to do just a non-profit, you have to think about the legal framework. And so it connects also with the actual network that is starting to build here. So, well, one of the starting point was about open science from the perspective that knowledge is a common good, like hair or water. And I learned recently going to Chile that, for instance, in Chile, water is private. So, but I stand on the side that any knowledge and scientific knowledge should be like widely accessible without having a barrier like a paywall. And beyond that, it has also to be not only accessible, but co-constructed by everybody. So like not having one source of knowledge that spread to the others in a unidirectional fashion, because it could lead to a cultural imperialism, but how we can, as a species, co-construct our knowledge together. And Wikipedia maybe embodied well this new model to have like the dream of D'Alembert and Diderot, but at a massive horizontal level, with anybody can criticizing anybody else and reaching a consensus of what we consider as valid. It doesn't work all the time, and I encourage you to look at the discussion tab on Wikipedia for controversial topics, like, for instance, the Scientology or stuff like that. And actually, the discussion part is more interesting than the article itself. But Wikipedia is a kind of this shift of mentality about our relationship to knowledge. Oh, I'm attacked by SPM. So, but the problem is that people thinking about our society as a knowledge society, people also talk about the information economy, and with the talk we just heard, it's not about only information or data, it's also about people carrying this knowledge and values that we want to carry it. And so like, we need to also think about wisdom beyond knowledge. And the state of science is exactly showing this clash between values and ideas. People are starting to do science for how it's real, it's fun, it's cool, and then realize that academia is not at all what they idealize about science in the first place. And that's something that was at the root also of this IQ PhD association, this kind of clash, realizing, entering in PhD, how, well, open science was not only about putting your data, open data, but maybe have a reflection about inclusivity, transparency, and what we want to do as a scientist to make a collective and inclusive community. And, well, in history, there have been other communities that has go through this opening process. And open source, for instance, in computer science, has been one of those communities. Maybe one of the best to illustrate how we can have a gradient of what openness mean. And so, for instance, here I took 3 different actors of the open source movement. So on the right is Richard Stallman, who was more for the GNU public license and more for free software and not open source as a just opening the source code, but also about free speech and freedom at the value level. While in the other extreme, you have Bob Young, who is not so famous, but he's wearing a red cap because he's the founder of Red Hat. So maybe some of you have heard about Red Hat. So that was the first person to basically sell the open source operating system. So he managed to make a business model out of something that was free. So that's kind of completely different perspective on open source, right? And in the middle, it's Linus Torvald. I had the chance to meet him. He's like a Finn, totally pragmatic, hating to have to socially interact for solving problems. And for him, open source is more like a way of optimality, and this how any people should code. Like it's more like a pragmatic stance, neutral, pragmatic. So, well, open source has been blooming. You can have, like, for instance, very funny and ironical facts, like Windows servers for Hotmail, for instance, run on Linux. So it has been proved to be even more efficient from a safety and security point of view. And, well, open source is kind of a success story over the years. And open science is kind of even hijacking logo of open source initiatives sometimes, trying to do the same thing in the scientific research process. And I delineate 3 main pillars of open science. First, the technology and digital practices that were kind of connecting to the open source in a way, but were also a trigger to question the previous model, especially at the publishing level, because suddenly anybody can put quickly his paper out there and not having to rely on Elsevier or whatsoever other publisher mafia. The other 2 pillars are more like connected to the core value that maybe brought us in the first place in science, which are collaboration and sharing, and the fact of researching and learning new knowledge. And well, if you look at the literature, there are many definitions of open science. And over the last decade, it has been such a blooming of initiatives and institutional incentive to go to open science that, like in the case of open source software, you have different perspectives that are not necessarily even compatible between each other. So that's interesting to notice. But here is like a kind of neutral definition. So open science refers to a scientific culture. It's characterized by its openness. Scientists share results almost immediately and with a very wide audience, which is not that much already connected to what I said about transparency and inclusivity and so on. It's more like about accessibility here. And so from the open source, we can move to the open course. And maybe one of the first example of how digital technology changes our relationship with knowledge have been like the MOOCs. So maybe you're familiar with those like massive open online courses. I would go back to that at the open washing level at the end of the talk, but the idea initially was very positive to say like, we're gonna give our courses to the rest of the world, like MIT, Courseware, or Coursera, or edX, etc. So that's one of the first trigger. And the second one is open access, which is like a large part what open science is at the institutional level right now, which is kind of a reflection of the state of affairs of publishing industry, who are engrossing huge profit compared to any other industry in the world, while basically working on benevolence of researcher on the side. I mean, some people call it a scam even. Like, so open access is this kind of legitimate and totally obvious problem that is popping in front of us, that actually scientists are pretty blind to it initially. So it was funny to see how you explain to anybody outside academia how peer review and you pay journals and so on work, they would say like, that's wrong. I mean, it's a common sense to say that's wrong. And so a lot of people agree immediately on that. And so, for instance, I put two persons that were quite important in those movements. First, Aaron Schwartz, who was like on top of actor on open access, was activist on many aspects about accessibility of knowledge in general, and unfortunately committed suicide in 2013. If you're interested, there's a wonderful documentary showing how hard and complex this kind of topic is and what this guy has done. It's called The Internet Boy or something, which is like very nice. And the other one is Alexandra Arbakian, famous for Sci-Hub. She's like a Russian physicist and kind of stubborn about open access as well. And she's alive and well, and she's fighting still. Those two people are, for some government, illegal people, criminals, because they are massively wanting to break copyright infringement, do copyright infringement. And meanwhile, they are fighting for accessibility of scientific knowledge. So that's also the kind of tension here. But so behind open access, there's not just the free, like in free lunch. It's not just having a PDF accessibility like most people just want in the first place. It's also about the right to reuse the information. So for instance, in humanities, there are a lot of people doing bibliometric analysis who need to scrap papers, and Elsevier right now is kind of playing with that by saying you can access the paper, but you are not allowed to automate the scrapping. So there's fights at the legal level for even having the right to use this matter in a very scientific way for bibliometric analysis, for instance. So yeah, so if you don't know Sci-Hub, it's sometimes faster than your own institutional access. So It's good to know. Another big change came from reproducibility and reproducibility science. We were discussing that with Josh. Well, Center for Open Science in Charlottesville has been held by the Sloan Foundation. Those are the same guys who found Python as the Sloan Foundation. So the Center for Open Science with Brian Nosek tried to propose a tool for people to have out there a way to put their data, their scripts, and collaboratively work on scientific project. And the very clever idea to kickstart this open science framework that I encourage you to create an account and use was to create a massive project for reproducibility in psychology. So what they did is basically reacting to some statement like Ioannidis, for instance, from the Stanford Center for Reproducibility Science, basically explaining how it's not even that RDoc is not efficient, it's that even claims based on biomedical research appear to be half of the time false. So we need to be cautious about that. I won't throw the baby with the bathwater, but how we can actively, as a scientific community, act on that in a rigorous way. And so what Nosek and the Center for Open Science did is taking 100 studies famous in psychology and massively try to replicate that across the world, and then compare the initially reported effect size and statistical significance with this reproducibility approach. And so if we take our threshold, about a third of the studies were replicated. So, and they didn't took like random studies, they took really famous psychological experiments. So that was the first clash. People were like, oh yeah, but that's psychology. No, they did that also with cancer research. They did that with other fields. And there is a big problem with reproducibility. And open science, by making the scripts and the data more transparent, is a way of reacting to that. So that's one of the things. So I did that with my first PhD student. So she's the super drawing nicely the problem of reproducibility here. So when I started in Pasteur, I tried to reproduce a nature methods paper that was like super highly cited, but nobody was really trying the methods. They were like just citing the paper. And it was written in MATLAB. The person who did that sent me the code, sent me the data, so it was really collaborative. I tried to recode everything in Python, and I couldn't reproduce the results. And at some point, the guy stopped answering my emails. So, well, and so we wrote a full paper. So, yeah, and the thing also is that Nature Methods refused to publish of course, our rebuttal. So we ended up writing a paper more from a sociology, anthropology perspective. I'm not at all from sociology, anthropology, but well, we took the occasion to try that and try to relate all the problems we ran into to reproduce this initial paper. And so that's like the wonderful iceberg drawn by Youngmin Kim, my PhD student, like showing how you have this very attractive nature method paper and you're like in the Titanic falling, running into it, while ignoring all the problems that can be causing non-reproducibility of what they are claiming in the paper. And so our answer to that we try to propose in this paper is to have more standardized consensus data sets where people can share their methods and kind of standardize their way of unit testing what they are doing. So that's more bioinformatics, but I think this is the kind of mindset can be also brought to other type of research. And instead of having one paper and that's it, to have a more continuous perspective on publishing with like the paper can be V1, V2, with the coverage of all the data sets that are in these consensus data sets. So instead of having this hard threshold about non-published, published, to see more the continuity of expanding the reproducibility of a given method. And so I choose to show the preprint instead. Now it's published in a open access journal, but initially we put it on preprint in bioRxiv to introduce 3 other aspects that popped up with this open science kind of movement. First, preprint, so bioRxiv. Second, the research ID, or archive, sorry, and altmetrics. So maybe you've heard about those 3 things. The first one, archive, is pretty pragmatic. It's to have like a unified identifier for researcher. Actually, I realized also with my PhD student how it was useful, for instance, for people from Asia, because there's a lot of overlap of family name, and having an archive ID is very convenient for understanding the literature of one and the production of one person. But it's also very convenient for anybody to fill all the forms on most of the institutional and journal website, because you put your archive and it fills all the forms automatically. The second thing is altmetric. Altmetric is not a revolutionary metric that will replace the other metric. I would say it's replaced more like the chit chat that were at the coffee, right? The way the chit chat on Twitter now. So like an index of how a paper is discussed by people. And so it kind of highlights papers that currently are controversial or highly discussed because of good or because of bad. So if you write about memes and cats, maybe you would have a huge altmetrics. Doesn't mean the paper is going to be super nice, but a lot of people would talk about it. And for preprint, well, it's kind of attacked directly this nonsense of scientific publishing. So like I love XKCD because I'm a nerd, so and it's kind of embodied well the state of the situation. So we have received your manuscript, The Bizarre Economics of Academic Publishing, Why Volunteer Peer Reviewers Should Rise Up and Demand Payment for For-Profit Journals. We have elected not to send it out of review. And well, physicists knew that for years. Archive goes back in 2005, but the biomed research, which is like kind of holding on their data and not really open in the first place, discovered that even from a pragmatic point of view, preprint are useful, because you can have, instead of having 3 reviewers with full of conflict of interest giving you feedbacks, you can have people out there that are genuinely interested in making you progress in your research that can give you feedback with this system. So yeah, that's a big change. One of the last aspects is built upon the big data hype and open data, and how basically it goes like bread and butter with the open source and the scripts and the open access, how you can leverage all this effort to collect data and make it first for the reproducibility sake, but also for meta-analysis and avoiding people to collect data for forever on the same topic. So for instance, we had big discussion. I'm working now in autism research, and it's like a minefield of non-reproducibility science. Basically having only the data accessible for any paper that is underpowered would be a big step, because then you could collect all these underpowered studies and start to make real powered studies. But having like 20 participants on hard drive of a postdoc that leave the lab somewhere and you never use those data, it's kind of a lose of time and energy and a lot of funding from taxpayer money as well. So the problem with open data is that also it enters in conflict with a huge problem with privacy and consents and patient rights. So you have to be careful. In Europe, we have these general data protection rules that come up. And well, when you're a researcher, you need to be also a writer, a statistician. Now you need to be a lawyer as well. So yeah. And recently, the Association for Psychological Science proposed a way to navigate also all those things in a very convenient way. I like badges, so those are a convenient way when you read a paper to see if the researcher who made the study actually made their pre-registration of the study, which is like a big quality for saying like it's not cherry picking afterwards, but they thought about it, they really had this hypothesis, and we are seeing the outcome of this hypothesis. And if the materials and the data are open. So that's a very interesting move, and a way also to clearly, directly see that. So you've seen like there is a lot of open down here, and maybe open is not that good either, as it appears. So to show you the trends, so it's not like in 1965 there's a hyperscaling recording at that time. It's more like open science was also discussed before it was a hype, so it's not that new already. But you see that clearly there is a rise of interest about open science. And it has become like really a buzzword. So that's the shortest definition I've seen, like fashionable and popular, some technical and important, and used to impress people. But actually, well, the most funny example to me is Carlos Moedas, the new commissioner of science in Europe, like open innovation, open science, open to the world. It's like a hyper method for hyperscanning, but the open version. And interestingly, for Carlos Moedas, openness is not at all what I discussed initially. For him, openness is having the data and the scientific and the scientific work fed back in the economy. So it's a completely different way of seeing open science. And that's why also in France there is a big change now in Ministry of Research. It's not now, it's the Ministry of Research and Innovation. So like a big novlang switch. But so this is one of the buzzwords. They understood that there were a big interest in open science, but not necessarily they took all the values with them. So there are other nonprofits like Open Knowledge Foundation that have a more core value about knowledge as a common good. So in their case, they have the notion of free to use, but also to reuse and redistribute without any legal, technological, and social restriction, which is like a good definition, I guess. But beyond this open washing at the institutional level, there are other examples of open washing that are out there. So for instance, the first one is linked to open access. So interestingly, all the publishers were like, oh, open access is so bad. Look at those journals that pretend to be journals and ask you money and doesn't do the peer review and so on. And that exists. It's called predatory publishing. And for the beginning of the open access movement, Nature Publishing Group and so on, they have like this op-ed and news saying like, oh, open access was bad. And now they have Nature Communication, scientific reports, and making a lot of money out of open access. So that's how discourse have changed on that. But predatory publishing still exists. And actually, even Scientific Report and Frontiers have been attacked to be predatory publisher at some point. So and the cursor is not clear because I have published in Frontiers, but indeed it's like a very strange thing. The other example is the Uberization of labor. So I was discussing about hackerspace and all these new venues that you can see in different cities. And it goes also with a form of association asking to do independent research. But the thing is, for what? So for instance, in France, we have pharma company like Roche, who had like an open research program. And so it's having 50 people working for free for Roche, which is like one of the leading pharma company. So we have to be careful how open research and those claims about openness can be also associated with even more precariousness in a situation where science is not like rolling on gold either, so it's playing on that. Then there's a fallacy of discourse versus practices that is very common. So for instance, in the case of open data, it's not about putting, like you've seen this morning with the hyperscanning data, if we don't have the README file and you just put this data on the FTP server, I mean, it's accessible, but it's unusable. So there's like a big difference between saying, oh yeah, the author accepts to share their data with anyone, and then you have a bunch of zip file coming in and get over it. I mean, that's not open data. So that's one fallacy. And the last one is actually connect to the MOOCs. So as I say, like MOOCs are massive open online courses, and it went from the first problem, which was this kind of imperialism at the cultural level, where like you had educated, industrialized, the weird country saying to other countries, yeah, we have the knowledge, here is the video, download, you will see. And the point is that Celia, who co-founded ActioPhD, has worked a lot on MOOCs, for instance, in Africa, countries who don't have the band pass or the access to the free broadband internet, that doesn't work. And in the end, if you do the sociology of MOOCs, it's mostly industrialized developed country and people who are already with high degrees who are watching MOOCs. It's not like the intended population in the first place for the discourse. And it goes even deeper in the open washing because now people have forgot what MOOC means, and there are even MOOCs that are payment. You have to pay to access the MOOC, which is like totally the opposite of what MOOCs was in the first place. So yeah, we have to be careful about this open washing. And that's another example of precariousness and Uberization of science. I don't know if you heard about Kaggle. Kaggle is a website where there's a kind of competition for data science. And so any company can put a data set and say, our goal is to, I don't know, optimize this quantity based on all this bunch of quantity. We have no clue about how it connects. And you have 3,000 or more people trying to reach the leaderboard and have the best classification. And the first 3, I think, have a couple of thousands of dollars. And so that's a very good way of having 3,000 people working on side project for big companies. And it's funny on the website because they say it's free as in free lunch. So it's totally the criticism that were initially done by Richard Stallman about free software, saying like software are not free like in free lunch or free beer, but like in freedom. It's not like the same thing. So it goes back to the business model because behind all this value stuff, if you don't have a business model behind that, well, you quickly run out of money and you don't know how to do that. So is it like a product, a crowdfunding? Is it volunteering? Is it donation? That's one of the hotspots, I think, where open science has not really solved the problem. And maybe it's because also it depends on the socioeconomic system in general and our relationship with intellectual property. But this is a hotspot. Another problem, so in open source, we had this gradient from making money out of it to no money and ideologically even being against. Another problem is embodied in this slide is the gender equality and inclusivity. So I encourage you to check on Twitter the Open Science hashtag to learn more about this problem of diversity in open science movement and show how even in a movement that initially was about openness and transparency, you have the same pattern reoccurring and how as a community we should be really knowledgeable and understanding all these patterns to avoid them to come back. And well, it goes also with rethinking our understanding of social structure. And so a lot of people now are even thinking about how to rethink labs and scientific institutions in a less feudal and pyramidal way and think about more networks and organic horizontal sharing and collaboration. That's applied already, with citizen science. So for instance, in astronomy or in ornithology, there's a huge collaboration between professional scientists, so to say, in research, in academia, and amateur scientists or scientists still, but who are not paid by an institution, but are making a tremendous work in astronomy, for instance. So like you may have heard about Galaxy Zoo or also other attempt to have also gamification of that, but there are a lot of people out there who are passionate about science and not labeled as scientists, but still want to collaborate. And that is also part of this change of dynamics. So to conclude, my point was to kind of sketch an overview of the different values and aspects of open science. But so to come back to this notion of data information versus more knowledge and wisdom, I think that beyond open science, maybe we need a more wise science, and instead of just focusing on accessibility, to have a focus on social value, and with patients, for instance, institutions and associations becomes obvious when you're doing research in the biomedical context. And well, to seek collective achievement and cooperation to achieve that. So thank you very much for your attention. I will not bother you anymore this time after. So yeah, you can check out icopg.org for the more information on that. And willing to take any questions.